There is a quiet belief that many empaths carry without ever questioning it. It isn't something they consciously choose. It is something they inherit from childhood experiences, from family dynamics, from cultural expectations, or simply from years of being praised for being the understanding one. The belief sounds noble on the surface. The more I give, the more I am loved. The more I sacrifice, the more valuable I become. At first, this seems like compassion. It looks generous, it feels virtuous, but over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your kindness slowly stops being a gift and becomes an obligation. You no longer ask yourself whether you have the energy to help. You ask whether you can afford to disappoint someone by saying no, and those are two very different questions. This is where many empaths unknowingly lose themselves. Empathy is one of our greatest human capacities. It allows us to imagine another person's inner world. It builds trust, deepens relationships, and reminds us that none of us are meant to navigate life completely alone. But empathy was never meant to erase identity. It was designed to create connection, not self-abandonment. When your emotional radar is constantly scanning for other people's needs, it becomes remarkably easy to overlook your own. You notice every shift in someone else's mood, every disappointment, every unspoken frustration. You become fluent in reading emotions that others barely recognize in themselves. Yet the irony is striking. The more skilled you become at understanding everyone else, the less familiar you become with your own emotional landscape. Psychologically, this creates an exhausting pattern. Your nervous system begins to equate peace with keeping everyone else comfortable. Conflict feels dangerous not because disagreement is harmful, but because somewhere along the way you learned that your role was to absorb discomfort before anyone else had to feel it. You become the emotional shock absorber in every relationship, and eventually even love begins to feel heavy. Not because love itself is exhausting, but because you have confused love with endless emotional labor. Think about how often people say you're so easy to talk to. It sounds like a compliment, and often it is. But for many empaths, those words come with an invisible cost. Being the safe place for everyone else slowly becomes your identity. People arrive carrying their fears, frustrations, disappointments, and confusion. You listen, you comfort, you reassure again and again, but who becomes that place for you? That question often sits unanswered, because somewhere deep inside, many empaths develop the quiet assumption that needing support somehow diminishes their strength. They become experts at holding space for others, while quietly running out of space within themselves. The philosopher would remind us that every virtue becomes destructive when it loses its balance. Courage without wisdom becomes recklessness. Confidence without humility becomes arrogance. In exactly the same way, empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect. This is not selfishness, it is mathematics. If you continually pour from a reservoir that is never replenished, it does not matter how pure the water once was. Eventually it runs dry. What makes this especially difficult is that exhaustion rarely announces itself dramatically. It arrives quietly. You become more irritable than usual. You lose enthusiasm for conversations you once enjoyed. Rest no longer feels restorative. You begin feeling emotionally responsible for everyone, while secretly wondering why no one seems responsible for you. The tragedy is not that you care too much. The tragedy is believing that your value depends on how much of yourself you are willing to lose in the process. Healthy compassion has never required self-erasure. In fact, the people who sustain meaningful compassion over decades understand something that exhausted empaths often forget. Giving is most powerful when it is a choice, not a compulsion. When generosity flows from fullness instead of fear, it nourishes both the giver and the receiver. So perhaps the first decision is not learning how to love people less. Perhaps it is learning that your own well-being deserves the same compassion you offer so effortlessly to everyone else. Once you begin to understand that endless giving is not the same as love, another realization quietly emerges. Protecting your energy is not primarily about changing the people around you. It is about changing the relationship you have with yourself. This is where the conversation becomes more challenging because it asks us to look inward instead of outward. Many people believe that boundaries are conversations you have with others. They imagine them as difficult words, uncomfortable confrontations, or firm declarations of what they will no longer tolerate. Those moments certainly matter, but the most important boundary is rarely spoken aloud. It is an internal decision that no one else can see. It is the moment you stop believing that every emotion in the room belongs to you. Empaths often possess an extraordinary sensitivity. They notice tension before anyone says a word. They sense disappointment hidden beneath a smile. They can feel anxiety, sadness, frustration, or loneliness almost as if those emotions were their own. This ability can be deeply beautiful. It allows them to create profound connection. But sensitivity becomes suffering when awareness turns into responsibility. There is a crucial difference between understanding someone's pain and assuming ownership of it. Psychologically, many empaths collapse that distinction without realizing it. If someone they love is unhappy, they immediately begin searching for what they should do. If a friend is struggling, they feel guilty for experiencing joy. If someone withdraws emotionally, they instinctively ask themselves what they did wrong. The mind becomes a relentless investigator, trying to solve emotional mysteries that may have nothing to do with them. This is not empathy, it is over-identification, and over-identification quietly steals freedom. One of the greatest misconceptions about caring is the belief that love requires emotional fusion, that if I truly care, I must carry your burden as though it were my own. Yet, healthy relationships are built on connection, not emotional merging. Two people can stand beside each other without becoming each other. Imagine standing on the shore, watching someone struggle against powerful waves. Compassion inspires you to throw them a rope, to encourage them, perhaps even to enter the water if you are genuinely capable of helping. But if you allow panic to pull you under with them, neither of you reaches the shore. The same principle exists emotionally. You can witness pain without drowning in it. This requires a subtle but transformative shift in perspective. Instead of asking, how do I make this person feel better? You begin asking, what is actually mine to carry? That question changes everything. Because not every disappointment requires your intervention. Not every conflict demands your mediation. Not every silence needs your explanation. And not every emotional storm is yours to calm. There is another force that quietly keeps empaths trapped in this cycle: guilt. Guilt has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as morality. It whispers that saying no is unkind, that resting while someone else struggles is selfish, that disappointing another person makes you a bad friend, partner, parent, or colleague. But guilt is not always evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is simply evidence that you are doing something differently than you have before. Growth often feels uncomfortable precisely because it interrupts familiar patterns. People who have grown accustomed to unlimited access to your time, attention, and emotional energy may not immediately celebrate your boundaries. They may misunderstand them. They may question them. They may even resist them. Not because your boundaries are unfair, but because your previous self made limitless availability seem normal. This is why protecting your energy cannot depend on external approval. If you need everyone to agree with your boundaries before you honor them, they are no longer boundaries, they are negotiations. Real emotional maturity is the ability to remain compassionate without becoming consumed, to listen without absorbing every emotion, to support without rescuing, to care deeply while recognizing that every person is ultimately responsible for walking their own path. There is tremendous freedom in realizing that you are not responsible for fixing every broken heart you encounter. Your presence matters, your kindness matters, your willingness to listen matters, but healing is not something you can perform on behalf of another person. It is a journey they must choose for themselves. When you stop carrying what was never yours, you discover something unexpected. You do not become colder, you become clearer, your compassion grows more intentional, your generosity becomes sustainable, and your relationships become healthier because they are no longer built on silent exhaustion. If you have followed this journey, you may notice that everything we have explored points toward one defining moment. It is not a dramatic event. There is no applause, no ceremony, no visible milestone. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, within your own mind, yet it has the power to transform every relationship you will ever have. It is the decision to value your inner peace more than the approval of others. At first, that sentence can sound almost uncomfortable. Many empaths have spent so much of their lives measuring themselves through the comfort, happiness, or acceptance of the people around them that choosing their own peace feels unfamiliar. There is often an immediate fear. Will people think I've changed? Will they see me as selfish? Will I disappoint those who depend on me? The honest answer is that some people will notice the difference. They may even struggle with it, but that does not necessarily mean you are becoming less loving. More often, it means you are becoming more authentic. There is an important distinction between being liked and being respected. Being liked often requires adaptation. You adjust yourself to avoid conflict. You soften your opinions. You silence your needs. You become whoever the moment seems to require. Respect, however, grows from consistency. It emerges when people know that your kindness is genuine because it is freely given, not extracted through guilt or obligation. For many empaths, seeking approval becomes a lifelong habit rather than a conscious choice. Every smile feels like reassurance that they are enough. Every disagreement feels like evidence that they have somehow failed. This creates a fragile emotional foundation because your sense of worth becomes dependent on circumstances you cannot control. The philosopher would argue that freedom begins the moment your identity is no longer negotiated by other people's opinions. Psychology reaches a similar conclusion. Emotional resilience develops when self-worth is rooted in values rather than validation. The two perspectives arrive at the same destination through different paths. When you no longer wake up trying to manage everyone's perception of you, something extraordinary happens. Your attention returns to your own life. You begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, how can I avoid disappointing everyone? You ask, what decision aligns with my values? Instead of asking, will they approve? You ask, can I respect myself after making this choice? Those questions create an entirely different future. This does not mean relationships become effortless. In fact, they often become more honest. Some relationships deepen because they were built on mutual respect from the beginning. Others begin to fade because they depended on your constant self-sacrifice. That can be painful, but not every relationship that ends is a failure. Sometimes it is evidence that you have outgrown a role you were never meant to play forever. One of the most liberating truths an empath can discover is that love and limits can exist together. You can care deeply while declining a request. You can forgive without reopening every door. You can support someone without becoming responsible for their choices. These ideas are not contradictions, they are signs of emotional maturity. Think about the people whose presence genuinely brings you peace. They are rarely the ones who say yes to everything, More often, they are people who know who they are. Their kindness feels calm rather than frantic. Their generosity is steady rather than exhausting. They do not help because they are afraid of rejection. They help because it reflects their character. That is the kind of compassion that lasts. When your emotional energy is no longer consumed by constant approval seeking, you begin investing it where it truly matters. You become more present in conversations because your mind is no longer rehearsing how to keep everyone happy. You become more creative because your imagination is no longer occupied by guilt. You become more patient because you are no longer operating from depletion. Perhaps the greatest surprise is that protecting your energy does not make your world smaller. It makes your connections richer. People begin to meet the real you instead of the version of you that existed only to satisfy expectations. Your relationships gain honesty because they are no longer sustained by silent resentment or hidden exhaustion. And most importantly, you rediscover yourself. The parts of you that had been buried beneath responsibility, people, pleasing, and emotional overextension begin to reappear. Your curiosity returns, your joy returns, your capacity to experience stillness returns. You realize that peace is not something another person gives you. It is something you protect through the choices you make every single day. In the end, the decision that protects an empath's energy is remarkably simple, though never easy. It is choosing authenticity over approval, boundaries over burnout, and self-respect over self-sacrifice. Because the greatest gift you can offer the world is not a version of yourself that is endlessly depleted. It is a heart that remains open because it has finally learned how to protect the person it belongs to.